This is Fauxthentic History.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Brian Young.
Today we are going to talk about one of the most prominent and well-known military leaders in galactic history. So the name Tarkin normally conjures up images of a cold, highly intelligent, and ruthless military and political figure for most people. And looking at his life, it becomes really easy to see how those characteristics were seated in his early upbringing. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
It is. And before we dive into that, Holly and I have been having a discussion about how we pronounce the location of his early upbringing.
Right.
And
we don't inherently, like, our natural pronunciations don't go to the same place.
No, not at all. And I think that I've heard from some sources one way that confirms my bias, and you've heard from others your way, and I'm not sure what we're going to do. I think we're just going to go our separate ways on it. So how do you pronounce it, Holly?
I say it Ariadu.
And I say it Ariadu.
Which I don't know why your way makes me giggle, but it does. I don't. Is it the hard I? I'm not sure what it is, but it's just because it sounds different, I imagine.
I can hear him saying it like that, though, like Edu, but with just the rye in the middle.
See, I think that's why my brain goes the other way, because I'm like, they can't all sound exactly the same.
Yeah.
But I don't know. You be the judge. So probably Brian and I will say it different ways, and whichever way you don't like, we apologize for.
And whichever way you do like, you're welcome. So, Moff Tarkin was born on the planet of Ariadu in the Outer Rim. The Tarkins had lived on Ariadu for 1,000 years after moving there from the core. And this pioneering move was sanctioned by governmental powers on Coruscant as a means of expanding Republic reach. And once settlers, such as the Tarkin family, had moved onto a world and established it as a viable point of potential trade, it was considered for inclusion in the Galactic Republic.
Now that I've heard Brian say it over and over, I want to say Ariadu, so I'm just going to go with that. So Ariadu's topography was a mix of jungles and mountainous areas, with plenty of hazards for humanoid species. So Wilhuff's ancestors were among the first colonists to settle the planet when it was still completely wilderness.
The Tarkins also set up first a police group, like then a militia, which eventually evolved into a more formal organization, which was called the Outland Regions Security Force. While initially these efforts were to protect their interests on the planet, as Ariadu became more important on trade routes, the threat of pirates became the focus.
And because of the family's status as some of the planet's oldest and most influential settlers, Moff Tarkin was born into a life of wealth and privilege. But what's really interesting here is that the family was really keen not to let their affluence make them weak. And a significant part of family tradition involved what some might consider relatively cruel treatment of their children under the pretext of didactic measures.
For one, there were frequent retellings of the various threats the planet's inhabitants, and specifically the Tarkins, had faced over the centuries. And there was no holding back on the brutal details for young ears. For another, there were small reminders on occasion of the inherent cruelty of life, such as a meal being taken away before a child had the chance to eat it.
And that particular incident, a meal being taken away in Moff Tarkin's life, was followed with a question from his mother as to whether he thought he could survive if he was turned out on the street with nothing. So while their family, as I said, had incredible wealth, there was this concentrated effort to stamp out any sense of entitlement.
One of the long-term means of training that Moff underwent while growing up was a series of wilderness trips with his granduncle Jova Tarkin. And while Moff had often heard his family reference the carry-on through his youth, he didn't know what it was for quite some time. And once his father did bring it up as a place that young Moff would eventually see, he described it as, quote, a place that teaches you the meaning of survival.
And in truth, and to be more specific, the Carry-On, which is part of the Carry-On Plateau, was a place where some male members of the family would be taken to test their mettle and determine if they had the potential for greatness. So Granduncle Jova had undergone the training and testing on the Carrion Plateau, and he actually decided to stay there after he was finished, to serve as a guide for future generations after he had wrapped up his own initiation.
But even after Wilhuf was told about the carry-on, he wasn't taken there immediately. He was told that at some point someone would come for him, and he would have to go there and be tested. And so he waited, looking forward to the idea of such a thrilling and potentially deadly adventure with a certain level of excitement and anticipation.
So the day after Wilhuf turned 11, 3 men that he had never seen before showed up at the family compound, and one of them was his granduncle Jova, and they were there to take the young Tarkin away. And at this point, Wilhuf surprised the adults by having a bag packed and ready, as well as clothing suitable for the outdoors that he had secretly stitched himself. And within moments, he was gone, off to the Carrion Plateau, and there was no tearful goodbye from his parents or any words of comfort. There was simply the acknowledgement that the young man's time to go through an honored family ritual had come.
The 3 men and Wilhuf traveled via an elderly speeder with 2, of course, Rhodians to the destination, a wild part of Eriadu preserved for trials such as the one he was about to endure. In very short order, the boy who had lived his life comfortably, save for his parents' lessons in the world's unfairness, was hunting alongside his granduncle and guides, cutting open their prey and eating the raw liver of their kill.
And he learned to survive in the harsh wilds of the planet, gaining a sense of the world by proximity to danger and death. Occasionally, Jova offered brief verbal lessons along with these very physical, challenging adventures they were on, including one that went, quote, "Never try to live decently, boy, not unless you're willing to open your life to tragedy and sadness. Live like a beast, and no event, no matter how harrowing, will ever be able to move you."
This brutal experience included very real loss. A relative was killed when their camp was attacked by reptiles with venomous saliva, and Wilhuf himself came close to the end of his life several times from hunger, from poisonous insects, from hungry predators. And in the evenings, the older men would tell him about how the planet had been settled and how the survival skills he was learning were not just for the wilderness, but for his entire life.
So at the end of the Carrion Plateau's summer season, Wilhuf returned home, but Jova came for him every year for the next 5 years to take him out to the wilderness in the summers and toughen him up.
The sixth time that Jova took Wilhuf away for the summer, he had the young man's final test in mind. And this would be the trial that would mark his transition into manhood, into a Tarkin that would rise above the average man.
So at the center of the Carrion Plateau was this hill that was 100 meters in height, with a 20-meter pinnacle of black volcanic glass. And for his trial, Wilhuf had to spend 1 full day on top of the hill with no provisions and a vibrolance as his only weapon. But he wasn't immediately put to this test. First, he was allowed to observe the predatory animals called virmuks that populated the area, and these were a significant challenge in this whole test. So Tarkin was going to have to climb to the top, up on the top of that volcanic glass, stay there, and then make an escape. And so he spent several weeks learning the Virmuk's habits and social structure while he was formulating his plan for how he was going to go about the test.
When the young Wilhuf inserted himself into the Virmuk's territory, he ended up catalyzing a coup among the beasts. Once an underling had bested the alpha, Tarkin killed the victor and was able to walk away from the spire without challenge from the remaining pack. He was the last Tarkin to survive that specific rite of passage.
And Tarkin carried the lessons that he learned on the Carrion Plateau, cunning, ruthlessness, and survival above all else, right into his adulthood and career, as Jova and his friends had told him he would.
So, moving on to his military life, as Tarkin's family had initiated the militia that became a more organized and official force, it was no surprise that Wilhuf joined the Outland region's security force himself as a teenager. It was during this phase of his life that he distinguished himself by besting a pirate operation from the Senex sector that had been raiding Lomite shipments.
So an alliance called Kanaz Marauders, named for their leader, who had received combat training from her career bodyguard father, had established a pattern where some of their number would focus on tracking and engaging with security vessels that were carrying these shipments, while their partners went after the actual cargo. And this simple but effective approach enabled them to separate cargo containers from their grouping and then slave them to their own ships for easy getaway. And then the pirates would either sell those goods back to the company that they stole them from, or they would move them on the black market. And in any case, this was a very real nuisance to Eriadu and the surrounding trade routes.
It was Tarkin, using the same observation and analysis skills he'd honed while watching the Virmuk Pack, who finally unraveled the legendary pilot Kanaa's system by which she selected which containers her team would pilfer. It turned out she was using a personal code that tied date-based numbers to her name, and while it appeared random, once the code was known, it was easy for Tarkin to see she was essentially signing every theft with her own moniker.
So working with his cousin, Ranulph Tarkin, Wilhuff booby-trapped several cargo containers with a computer virus, so that when Kanaa's marauders next attacked, the process of slaving the containers to their own ships overwrote the jump coordinates the thieves had entered, and instead delivered them right into the hands of the security force.
With that move, 18-year-old Wilhuff Tarkin had outperformed men far senior to him. In a brutal follow-up intended to send a message to any other pirates who might have designs on the shipping convoys, Tarkin had Kanaa and her crew sealed into a shipping container and sent that container into the system's sun, broadcasting the gruesome deaths of those aboard over pirate channels. It's not a... He's a very not nice man.
He's ruthless.
Yeah.
And after his triumph with the Outland region's security force, Tarkin made his next step in his military career, attending the Sullust Sector Spacefarers Academy. And while he was there, he caught the attention of someone who would end up having a significant impact in Tarkin's life, and that was Sheev Palpatine.
Palpatine actually sought out Cadet Tarkin and hinted that he might be able to assist Eriadu with some political maneuvering to address the ongoing issue of piracy in the system. As the two men talked, then Senator Palpatine became aware of how politically insightful Tarkin was.
And so the senator actually offered to help Wilhuff get into the Judicial Academy. That was the training ground for the Galactic Republic's peacekeepers. And he said he would do this if the younger man would at least consider moving away from his military ambitions and into politics. And Tarkin shrugged off the idea when the two discussed it, and he went into the Judicial Academy as planned.
Palpatine had predicted that due to the distance of Eriadu from the core worlds, Tarkin would struggle to fit in among the other students who would see him as an uncultured and backwater, despite the fact that the Tarkin family possessed more wealth than most core families, and he was correct.
Yeah, unfortunately, Wilhuff's arrival at the Academy was full of pomp, so he got there in this Outland region's security force warship that the ORSF and his father had arranged, wearing full formal dress. It was this big, very, very obvious and sort of flamboyant arrival. And this gave his fellow plebes there ammunition for teasing, and they took advantage of it from day one. And this led to a lot of fights with his peers, and then to top that off, he found himself in trouble with the administration because of his involvement in those scuffles, even when he felt he was just defending himself.
Tarkin was able to overcome his rocky start as he once again managed to make a name for himself with his quick thinking and natural leadership skills. On a mission to Halcyon that was staged in cooperation with Jedi, Tarkin's team of judicials, under the hapless direction of another officer, ended up lost in the planet's wilderness. It was Tarkin who led them through the ordeal into their target, and from that mission on, Tarkin was not only hailed as a hero, but he began to take on a legendary reputation, with a vast assortment of tales accumulating in his rumor mill dossier.
And his aggressive approach to meeting problems head-on came to be known as the Tarkin Rush, and over the years it eventually started to be taught as part of military strategy.
But while he was unquestionably successful in the judicial forces, Tarkin began to feel a sense of unrest as the group fractured. As separatist sentiments began to clash more and more with Republic ideologies, the judicials similarly split, meaning that there were times when Tarkin found himself fighting against people who had been his comrades.
And additionally, he recognized that the friction of the galaxy could really spell trouble for his home planet of Eriadu. So feeling that someone needed to protect Eriadu from being drawn into this conflict and potentially, the structure of the whole planet really being challenged, Tarkin began to think once again of Palpatine's urging to enter the world of politics.
And he did enter politics, so it took almost no time for Tarkin to become the governor of Eriadu, thanks to the help of Palpatine. Of course, the ever-scheming Sheev also made use of Tarkin to further his own ambitions and agendas. During the Eriadu Trade Summit, a meeting between the Republic and the Trade Federation, violence broke out. Several members of the Trade Federation Directorate were killed, and there was an attack made on Chancellor Valorum's life.
And there were a lot of threads to untangle regarding that attack and figuring out what was going on. And Valorum wanted to mount a full investigation, but Tarkin obstructed the Chancellor's efforts so that he could help Palpatine. So, as a consequence, the seeming ineffectiveness of Valorum weakened his position, and that really paved the way for Palpatine's rise to power.
During the Clone Wars, Tarkin was in the thick of things, having joined the Republic Navy when the conflict started.
Tarkin was active in a number of battles and military operations throughout the period of the Clone Wars, and he served along Jedi at some points in time, although he increasingly felt that they were basically ineffective.
But the action that could be argued as having the most significant impact on the events of the Galactic Republic was his effort to prosecute Ahsoka Tano for a bombing attack that was made on the Jedi Temple. As other suspected perpetrators died during the investigation, Tarkin became convinced that Ahsoka was killing off her accomplices.
So Tarkin went so far as to ask the Jedi Council to expel Tano from the Jedi Order so that she could be tried in a Republic court rather than by the Jedi. His concern was that there was absolutely no way a Jedi-led hearing could be impartial. This was a controversial request and one the Jedi were not pleased to have been made of them, but they ended up bending to Tarkin's wishes. Tarkin headed up the prosecution and the trial, and Senator Padme Amidala served as Ahsoka Tano's defense.
Ahsoka's jury returned a verdict, but before it could be read, Anakin Skywalker, Ahsoka's Jedi Master, appeared in the courtroom with new evidence, a confession from Ahsoka's Jedi Padawan peer, Barriss Offee. Offee was displeased at the direction the Jedi Order had taken while embroiled in the conflicts of the Clone Wars.
And while this confession exonerated Ahsoka Tano, she did not rejoin the Jedi Order, as she felt that the organization had basically betrayed her in their handling of the accusation and the subsequent trial. And as we now know, of course, that meant that Ahsoka survived Order 66, which later wiped out the Jedi, and she was able to serve a key role in the founding of the Rebel Alliance.
And that wasn't actually his first interaction with Anakin Skywalker either. Anakin and Ahsoka had helped free him from military prison when he'd been captured by separatists with military secrets.
Yeah, like we said earlier, he had worked alongside Jedi at various points in time, so it was interesting that he seemed not very enthused with them, even though they had saved his bacon.
It was interesting reading that he and Anakin Skywalker actually shared similar feelings about the Jedi, though, and that would make a lot of sense later on down the road.
Yes, indeed.
So, during a deployment to Murkana, where Governor Tarkin and Lord Vader were investigating a cache of communications devices, Tarkin's ship, the Carrion Spike, was seized. This was part of a series of events which began with a fake distress call, an attack on Sentinel Base, the cache of communications equipment which Tarkin saw as bait to lure them away from the Carrion Spike, and then the thieves' escape with Tarkin's ship, which was one of the most advanced and powerful in the Navy.
So at this point, Tarkin, working alongside Vader, devised a scheme to track the stolen vessel through its fuel usage, predicting where it might jump to based on remaining fuel after having made several hyperspace jumps to evade capture. And they had to do this because for a while they were tracking the ship because Vader's meditation pod was on it, but the thieves jettisoned it, and so they lost that means of tracking since Vader had a connection to it, and once it was off the ship, that was a problem. So while the Carrion Spike was eventually abandoned by the thieves, it was also really badly damaged. And Tarkin's new ship was the Executrix, given to him by Darth Vader as recompense for the loss of the Spike. And as a reward for Tarkin's work throughout this ordeal, he was promoted to the position of Grand Moff.
As the Empire was established and gained power under Palpatine, Tarkin remained one of the Emperor's trusted allies. After Tarkin became negatively viewed for his work on quelling separatist remnants on Antar IV, in which he arrested and executed masses of people without determining their political loyalties one way or the other, the Emperor sent him on pacification missions to give the Grand Moff distance from the media nightmare.
And as the rebellion was still in its infancy, Tarkin became governor of the Outer Rim. In this role, he used the might of the Imperial forces to take control of planets and exploit their natural resources for food and materials to benefit the Empire and its projects. On the planet of Lothal, the camp that displaced farmers were moved into was even nicknamed Tarkin Town by the locals.
Tarkin recognized that the small rebel cells popping up on the various worlds the Empire had enslaved could prove problematic if they were ever able to unite. So on occasion, he'd travel to those worlds and try to stamp out dissidents himself.
And on Lothal, he used an Inquisitor to execute what he thought were ineffective Imperial officers for their failure to contain rebel activity in their jurisdiction. And he then used intelligence that he had acquired through a surveillance droid to mount a surprise attack on the rebels, and managed to capture Kanan Jarrus in the process. Additionally, Tarkin destroyed a communications transmitter to stop the spread of rebel sentiments, but not before that signal was transmitted to the citizens of Lothal for a brief period.
Jarrus was then taken aboard Tarkin's ship and interrogated, both by military intelligence and by an Inquisitor, but he resisted interrogation and gave up no information. He was transferred to Mustafar for additional torturous questioning.
Fortunately, Kanan Jarrus was rescued by rebel operatives, but during the rescue and the subsequent skirmish, Tarkin had something of a revelation. He realized that the rebellion was far larger and more organized and more capable than he or the Emperor had suspected.
And this kind of moves us into the next phase there. This is the creation of the Death Star. So the creation and helming of the Death Star was, of course, the achievement most often associated with Tarkin's career. And the project was fraught with tension and rivalry. The Emperor fostered rivalries among his people as a means of heightening their efforts and testing loyalty.
While director Orson Krennic oversaw the engineering, research and development, construction, and completion of the Death Star, Tarkin had always intended to seize command of the project once it had proven to function. And that way he had... I'm suddenly drunk. That way, had the project gone awry, it would have been harnessed to Krennic's career and Tarkin wouldn't have had to take the blame. But after a successful test of the super laser on the planet of Jeddah, which destroyed the holy city there, Tarkin made his move to take command, infuriating Krennic in the process.
While Krennic continued to jockey for the favor of the Emperor and command of the space station, rebellion forces were formulating a plan to seize the Death Star's plans in the hopes of using the data to formulate an attack to destroy what was already being rumored among Imperial forces as their greatest triumph. And those events, and indeed the Death Star itself, could be their own episodes.
Oh, for sure. And while the rebels staged a sneak attack on the Citadel Tower at Scarif where the Death Star plans were archived, Tarkin, willing to sacrifice the Scarif base and the forces there, actually used the Death Star to fire on the planet to prevent the completion of the rebel mission. As Krennic was also on Scarif at the time, this quickly ended the rivalry between the two men.
Tarkin was pleased when Darth Vader was able to capture Princess Leia Organa from Alderaan and bring her to the Death Star as a prisoner, but he grew frustrated when she refused to give up any real information, even under torture, and chose, after consulting with a council of high-ranking Imperials, to make an example of her home planet. He managed, after threatening to destroy the entirety of the princess's homeworld, Alderaan, to extract an answer from her as to the location of the rebel base. She falsely claimed it was on Dantooine, but Tarkin knew Alderaan would make a far more impactful statement, so he proceeded with his plan to destroy it.
And while previous uses of the Death Star super laser had been explained away with some PR spin as having some other cause in order to hide the fact that the Empire had actually been building such a weapon in secret and at great expense, the destruction of Alderaan was considered a showcase of the base's destructive power. The intent, of course, was to frighten all other systems that might resist Imperial rule into submission.
When Tarkin discovered that Leia's information about Dantooine had been a lie, he immediately ordered her termination. Unfortunately for her, a small group of dissidents was able to rescue her before that order could be carried out.
And Vader hatched a plan at this point, which Tarkin agreed to allow Leia's escape. They had actually placed a homing beacon aboard the ship that rescued her, which was the Millennium Falcon.
My guess is that that plan would have never worked for those rebels to get her off had Vader not come up with that.
Oh, for sure. I think they would never have left the Death Star.
Yeah. I mean, if Tarkin was willing to destroy all of Scarif, he probably would have blown up 3 decks and just vented them into space had they not said, no, this is the way we can get the rebels.
I think you're exactly correct.
So Vader's plan worked. The Imperials were able to track the location of the rebel base to Yavin 4, and they set a course for the Death Star to unfurl its destruction there. As the space station approached the target, a rebel military action making use of the information in the stolen Death Star plans was launching their own attack. They had discovered that engineer Galen Erso had placed a fault in the system that could be exploited. A perfect shot into the Death Star's exhaust port could cause a chain reaction that would tear the massive superstructure apart.
Tarkin's underlings actually saw this possible problem when they analyzed the attack of the rebel forces, and they brought it to the Grand Moff's attention. But Tarkin's steadfast belief that the Death Star was the ultimate in military technology led him to turn down the opportunity to evacuate. He believed that he was about to crush the rebellion and end the insurgency permanently.
Of course, this turned out to be a case of epic hubris. A single-star pilot, Luke Skywalker, was able to land a precision shot into the thermal exhaust port. The Death Star was destroyed, and Tarkin along with it.
Yeah, it's one of those moments that's sort of sobering when you look at this person who is very smart and very cutthroat and very capable, and his entire career was shut down in a second because he was prideful.
Well, you don't tend to think of a small, like, you don't think of a one pilot fighter as being any threat to a space station that literally houses thousands of one pilot fighters, right?
Yeah.
You just don't think, like, oh, sure, that one ship is going to take us out. And why would he evacuate? You know, Darth Vader was out there in his own ship, and he'd seen Vader more than capably tear apart entire fleets of rebel ships.
But he didn't trust his people when they brought him data.
No, they didn't. They didn't.
So, Tarkin's a fascinating creature.
He really is. So, do you have some mail for us, Holly?
I do this time. This is from our listener, Barbara. She says, thank you, Holly and Brian, for this great new podcast. Thank you, Barbara. That's very sweet to say. She says, I've told everyone I know about your spectacular crash courses into varied immersive fandoms. I discovered you a little over a week ago, and of course I've already listened to every episode you've released. Being a huge Star Wars fan, I appreciate all the episodes dedicated to that universe, and especially enjoyed and learned a lot on the Legend of the Bounty Hunters Guild. While I would not call my home a house divided, I am a Star Wars fan, and my husband is a fan of Star Trek, so it was delightful to have a meaningful conversation with him on his favorite fandom after listening to your episode on the eugenics wars. Thank you for making my marriage stronger, and keep up the good work. That is so sweet, Barbara. I just love that.
Yeah, I'm glad that people are finding ways to. I think that's the most fun I have about listening to your other podcast, Holly, is that I get to hear about things that I wouldn't ordinarily know to seek out for myself as far as history goes.
Yeah. And
this is exactly that, where it's like, I'm a big Star Wars fan, but this helped me engage with Star Trek in a level I didn't expect. I really love that.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think it's any secret that you or I, as historians and, just fans of things, are big Star Wars fans, but we have room in our hearts for lots of other things. So it's fun to get to delve into those and talk about them, and they're really unique and often very in-depth histories. Especially
since I think sometimes the other things that you and I are fans of can be drastically different.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, we have a pretty varied interest between the two of us. We don't have, other than Star Wars, our crossover isn't all that huge.
No, I think it is. I think we've got all the Disney I think we've got that Disney crossover, and I think we've got that Star Trek crossover. It's really every time I propose a fantasy episode.
Right. I see where you're trying to dog me for not being that big of a fan of fantasy. But I love that it is a rich
I'm not trying to dog
into. You're always trying to dog me, whatever.
I am not. You would we wouldn't be doing this or any podcast if I were actually trying to dog you at anything.
I know, you're a very sweet boy. In any case, Brian, tell people where they can email us or get in touch with us if they want to send us their emails.
If you'd like to send us more email, you can go to fauxthentichistory.com and use the contact form to get us an email directly. It'll get to both Holly and I, and we'd love to read some of these on the air. And you can follow us on Twitter at Fauxthentics, and you can find us on Facebook if you look up Fauxthentic History. And you can find us wherever podcasts can be listened to. And if you listen to us and like us, go ahead and leave us a review. We would appreciate that, whether that's on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever else you listen to it.
Yeah, and you can always visit both me and Brian, also through our personal accounts. I'm on Twitter as @surliestgirl.
And I'm at Swankmotron.
So,
unless you've got anything else, Holly,
I don't.
then I think that's the episode. And
I do.
You do have something.
I do. It's an apology. So if you have been listening to our show, you know that we usually publish every 2 weeks, like clockwork in our short life. But this time we're a week behind, and it's all my fault. So I just want to take ownership of that. It's my fault. Sometimes life gets a little out of control and you don't get your stuff written in time.
I told her we fixed it.
Okay. It's all good.
That was a Lando Calrissian joke.
I know.
Sorry.
Never apologize for a Lando reference, ever. Loud and proud.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and...